Welcome to History 101. My name is Christina Paris, and welcome back. Welcome back to History 101. My name is Christina Paris, and I'm your instructor for this course. Welcome back, and today we're going to be covering part 2 of United States history, or chapter 15, I should say. Reconstructing a Nation, 1865 to 1877. We're going to be picking up where we left off in part 1. So we're going to start out with Congressional Reconstruction, and we're going to open up talking about the South remade. So we talked about in the last part at the very end about the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment, as you may remember, actually established how the payment of the national debt would be handled. It barred Confederate officials from public office, and it removed the 3/5 clause. Now, some of you may be unfamiliar with the 3/5 clause. Maybe you are. The 3/5 clause established that a person would be a slave, namely, would be established as counting as 3/5 of a person towards counting congressional representation. And what the 14th Amendment said is that's not going to stand. Representation will now be established based on your state's population. So that's done away with, that 3/5 clause. It also guaranteed birthright citizenship. So when this becomes is established, this is proposed, I should say, Southern states who ratified the 14th Amendment were readmitted to the Union. However, you can understand that this didn't sit well with all Southern states. Some Southern states were a little resistant to this for obvious reasons. They still were old guard, what could be called old guard Southern states. They didn't like the thought of a slave now being counted as a full person. It was like, okay, that's kind of troubling. And also this idea of citizenship, birthright citizenship, was another thing that they took to task. Why should a slave receive the rights of a full citizen of the United States? Protection under law. That kind of also bothered him. There were some issues that kind of bothered some of these southern states as well, especially conservatives that openly rejected it. So you can see why some southern states kind of scoffed at the 14th Amendment. They were not happy about accepting it or ratifying it. So there's still some tension. And even with the president, we have to remember the president is very much still a southerner. And he is still very much in support of the southern ideals. Even though he was the president of the United States, he was still a southerner at heart. And he's still very much beating this drum of supporting the southern states, supporting these southern ideals. And we see this continuing aggression in the South, this continuing tension building in the South, this escalating violence, especially towards freedmen. And it's going to continue and it's going to intensify. And we also see this tension building with the president. The president begins to exhibit, I guess it can be called some erratic behavior. And what I mean by erratic behavior is not so much mental things as he begins to be under the impression that his life is being threatened, that he's going to be the next one to be assassinated. Now, maybe it is true that the tension is getting pretty high. I mean, we have to consider the tension of the times, the fact that we've already had a president assassinated. I mean, Lincoln is the first president to be assassinated. So maybe that was weighing pretty heavily on him. The fact that there was so much violence in the country, the fact that he was a southerner, that the fact that there was so much animosity growing. We do have to consider the weight of the times, the weight of his office. But he had been stumping very much against the 14th Amendment. And he was also beating this drum in support of the southern states. And against all of this, he started being very adamant that his office, the office of the president, had much more power than it rightfully should. And to this end, that he could make decisions that exceeded the capacity that the office of the president should. I don't know if many of you are aware of this, but there's a very much, our checks and balances system is in place that to protect that one branch of our government does not become more powerful than the other. And this includes the president's as well. The president is a branch of our federal government as well. And the idea is to make sure that the president doesn't become any more powerful than our Congress, and our Congress doesn't become any more powerful than our president. And Johnson seemed to want to exceed this particular check and balance system. And one of the sticking points in this matter was with regard to his cabinet. Now, maybe you are aware of this, maybe you're not. It works that the cabinet positions are generally to be vetted, which means to go through a process where the president will give a name for each cabinet position, like Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Interior, etc., etc. He will name certain people to these positions. They will then go to be essentially checked out before the Senate, before a panel of senators. And they will go through a series of hearings to be checked out to make sure that they have qualifications, that they have no ill ties to the president, to any foreign entities, to any questionable business dealings, etc., etc. And the idea is to assure that everything is good with why they have been nominated, that they haven't made some in our day, multi-million-dollar gift to the president for the position. And it should be that their nomination should be on the up and up. Now, I will say that in the past we have had some questions, and there have been some corrupt cabinets, very corrupt cabinets, that have been installed in the White House that have turned out to lead to some very questionable decisions being made. And we'll talk about that in the course of this class. But anyway, the idea is to check and make sure that there isn't anything that might compromise the administration overall, compromise the decisions that are made that will compromise the country and potentially lead to something cataclysmically going wrong for our country that could jeopardize our national security. And the only time we've ever had a situation where something like this could have gone completely awry was in the case of, shall we say, Richard Nixon and the Nixon administration. And that whole thing kind of blew up, and Nixon resigned, so nothing went horribly, significantly awry that could have compromised national security. Thankfully, Nixon resigned, so we didn't have to go into a corruption probe and all that, and would have blown up into some national security issue that could have led to, our country being compromised in such a way that it would have taken it onto a national and an international stage that could have drastically compromised. But it did have lasting implications. We'll talk about that when we get to that particular period in time in our history. But that's for another lecture and another time. But anyway, in this particular time, Johnson did decide that he had a lot of power. And he had a lot of power that exceeded what he was supposed to have. So Congress decided that they were going to enact laws to restrain Johnson's power. And one of these was the Tenure of Office Act. And what it was going to do was to limit Johnson's ability to remove people from cabinet positions without first going before the Congress. And, putting this particular individual through and, saying, this person needs to be removed from this position. Now, this incensed Johnson. He felt that this was a betrayal of trust, that this was a betrayal of his position as president. And he decided that he was going to test the Congress, that he was going to test the congressman. And he promptly turned around, and he had a conflict with one of his cabinet members. He turned around and he decided that he was going to remove this person from the cabinet without seeking the congressional approval before doing so. So he did it, and it incensed Congress that he did this in direct violation of the Tenure of Office Act, and they responded promptly by the House filing articles of impeachment against him for violating the Tenure of Office Act. Now, as we've seen, and we will continue to see in our country's history, that articles of impeachment generally is a good scare for a president. It generally is a beatdown for a president. Essentially, it is the most severe form of punishment that you can do for our executive officer, our leader of our country. It's a blemish on their record, their formal record, and their presidency. And we've had several examples now in history of this being done. And we've, knock on wood, have so far never removed a president, even though we've filed articles of impeachment against several now. We've never removed a president from office, a sitting president from office. We've filed articles of impeachment. We've voted on articles of, our Congress has voted on articles of impeachment. We've never successfully removed a president from office. But it's been enough to, be that blemish on their record. Varying degrees of blemishes, from a minor infraction to a more serious, this is kind of, that mark that tarnishes their reputation. In the case with Andrew Johnson, it fell a few votes shy of, formally impeaching him and formally, going any further, convicting him. So ultimately it failed. But it was enough to, nonetheless damage his already fragile reputation. Needless to say, it was at the end of his formal term as president. And it moves us towards the realization that Reconstruction is faltering. Congressional Reconstruction was faltering, and the violence was still there. The violence was escalating, in fact. By then, it had reached a fevered pitch. We see the Reconstruction reaching a point where it's leading to rioting. It's gotten so out of hand. It's reasonable to say that something significant has to happen. Something major has to take place. There has to be some kind of federal intervention to put an end to this violence, to this bloodshed that's tearing the South apart. It's going to lead to something that's going to boil over and lead to another war, essentially. And finally, the decision is made that the South is going to have to be divided up into 5 military districts, and that the military is going to have to be sent in to bring the South under control. Um, Another huge thing is that blacks are going to have to be enfranchised with the vote, um, to hopefully give another voice to the political instability down there. The hope is that by giving some additional voters, that some stability will come to the political situation. The union leagues are mobilized, and the goal is to educate the voters, these new voters, and to hopefully come up with a new educated elite down there. Um, Now, it did form electoral majorities in several states, and it did start to sway some of the votes. And things started to look promising, but the violence was still there. And we do see that there's this escalation in violence that continues. And we start seeing formation of paramilitary forces and things such as the Ku Klux Klan, which we'll be talking about here in a minute. We also do see some forces that begin to get derogatory terms, such as white Southerners that sided with Republican policies have become known as scalawags, and carpetbaggers, that was a derogatory term referring to Northern whites who moved to the South after the Civil War and supported the Republican Party. Because if you remember correctly, Republicans are not seen with positive outlook. The South is dominated by the Democrats. The Republicans are seen as this evil force that dominate the North. These are the moderates and radical Republicans that are trying to eradicate every trace of the Confederacy. They see the Confederacy as being almost like an infection down in the South that's hanging on to these old guard ideas that are going to turn the whatever chance of reuniting the North and South upside down. And they want to stamp it out completely, every way, shape, and form. These are the advocates for total loyalty from each state, not the 10% like Lincoln was. Lincoln was really kind of this conservative Republican, whereas these moderate and radical Republicans are total loyalists. They do not want a state that's going to go 10%. They want total loyalty from these states. If they're not going to be totally loyal, then forget bringing them back into the Union. They are advocating very strongly and very stridently for these states to be completely loyal to the Union. And if there's even a trace of the Confederacy left, they want it stamped out. They're the ones that are advocating for punitive actions against former Confederates. They don't want peace with the Confederacy. They want the Confederacy gone. These are very much they're very much against these elements because they recognize a danger in it to the Union. They see a danger within the white supremacy, especially towards the freedmen, that they see the potential for radicalized violence that's going to lead to what it eventually leads to, which is the Jim Crow laws, that's going to force in things like separate but equal, that's going to keep the freedmen at heel. And it's interesting how they're going to be, eventually the ones that are going to advocate, but they're also the ones that are going to capitulate with the bargain of 1877, which we're going to talk about in a minute here. Now, Interestingly enough, the achievements and failures of radical government, the elections had huge turnouts, but the leaders remained mostly white. Even though we have these elections with these huge turnouts, we're still seeing the leaders turning out to be mostly white leaders. Now you have to scratch your head and go, why is it that the leaders are still mostly white? Well, you have to remember that a good population, a good portion of the population are still white voters. They're still favoring white power. I hate to say it that way because it sounds so awful, but they're still favoring the white candidates. There are still predominantly just white candidates running for the large positions, the positions of governor, the positions of mayors, these large positions. There are no candidates that are running that are African American for these positions. The positions that most African American leaders are running for are legislature positions. We're not seeing candidates running in these positions for mayor, for governor yet. We're not seeing these positions emerge yet. The African American leaders that are running in these legislature positions, too, are an interesting demographic. They are predominantly representing pre war free elite. Um, a lot of them are in this very higher echelon of a minority group. They're not representing the freedmen. They're representing a group that has an exclusive access into a predominantly isolated minority group within the South. Some of them are either fair skinned African Americans that can, what is called, pass. They may be mulatto, which is mixed race. They may be part indigenous, Native American, African American. They might be part white African American, so that they appear almost fair skinned, so they really can move about in both societies without being distinguished. And it's only after the fact that they identify, hey, I'm actually part of your society. So there's really this interesting little dynamic that does emerge. Um, we also see that the individuals that do come from the freedmen run for positions that are primarily in a lower level, justice of the peace, sheriff. Not to say that these aren't still prominent positions in society, but these positions do not carry the same clout politically as legislature positions. It's not to say that there aren't freedmen that are running for legislature positions, but overall, there are so many fewer positions that they're running for in these slots as in legislature positions. We also see government funded infrastructure in education. It's interesting to note that demographically, we're not seeing a division yet based on race, where there's lower funding based on race yet. I say yet. This will happen eventually, where African American classes and schools will get much less funding than the white schools. This will happen in the South. This will undoubtedly start happening. Again, it goes to the Jim Crow system that envelops the South, where it's a separate but equal type dynamic that takes over. But for now, demographically, the funding that's received by the schools is equal. Also, something else that we see, which is kind of an interesting little dynamic that will take you by surprise, is there's an outlaw of racial discrimination taking place in public places. It's a small window that takes place. But it is actually illegal during this time to discriminate based on your race in the South. Um, you're kind of looking at me and going, "Hey, you mean you can't discriminate on your race at this point in time in history in the South?" Yeah, it's a very small window that takes place. But at this point in time, between the Civil War and between the passing of Plessy versus Ferguson, um, there is this small window where it's outlawed from discrimination based on race. It's very short, but it does happen. But once this window closes, it's going to be closed for a very long time. And then you're going to see separate but equal accommodations. And I always call it separate but unequal accommodations, because when you see the accommodations that they make based on race, the accommodations are anything but equal. They are horrifyingly unequal. And if you've seen some of the pictures that come out of the South when we come to the Civil Rights era, you're going to be, oh my word, they called that equal? Yeah. Very much not equal. Now, when we come to the political economy of sharecropping, I have touched on this briefly before, but I want to talk about it again. Sharecropping was one of those both good and bad systems that emerge in our society. At this time, it had its advantages and its disadvantages. It provided a source of income for people that were seeking a new way of life. Obviously, our freedmen, our white yeoman farmers that had lost everything through the Civil War, could rebuild their lives, could build a new life. But, and I say this but, it had a debt cycle attached to it that was potentially vicious and devastating. And if you fell into that debt cycle, which was called a crop lien, that debt cycle could be potentially bottomless. I talked about this before in my previous section, that the crop lien was both a blessing and a curse. Because yes, it allowed you to make purchases with crop that you had yet to grow, but you were hedging your bet on a crop that you had yet to not only grow, but harvest. There were too many factors there that you were hedging your bet on. It would be like going to Las Vegas and making a bet on the winnings you had yet to win. It's the same kind of thing. Are you guaranteed that you're going to win $10,000 on a $5 bet? That's pretty much the same thing a crop lien was. You're making a gamble that you can't guarantee is going to come in. Granted, you might be extraordinarily lucky and everything may pan out. And unlike the gamble in Vegas, you might have a fantastic chance. That whole crop might come in perfectly. The crop might yield, the same amount, the proper amount of cotton or the proper amount of tobacco or whatever you were going to grow, or indigo, and you might get all the money you need. But there were so many factors to take in. The weather held out, your water supply held out, that market prices held stable, that everything held out perfectly to yield the right amount so that you could pay that crop lien. And you would get your market value for that crop. And believe me, there were a whole lot of factors you had to prey held out for a season. And let's just say too many things in life are too unpredictable. If you broke a plow blade, if your mule suddenly got sick and died, if a devastating hailstorm came along and destroyed half your crop, if the prices of your cash crop suddenly fluctuated wildly and dropped suddenly to 50% of what they were at the beginning of the season, if you got sick and you weren't able to take care of your crop, or you had to hire a hand, someone to help with your crop, there's another added expense. Any number of things could go wrong, just like in any other aspect of life. But it was so much more tenuous because you already had a major outstanding debt against that crop. And any number of those things could send you into a tailspin. So it's something to think about. The gospel of prosperity. Now, prosperity was something that Northerners wanted to bring to the South more than anything. Obviously, they wanted to bring this sense of prosperity to the South to help them rebuild, to help them bring peace and love and hope. I mean, it makes sense. They felt that it would bring healing. And something that begins to invade the South after the Civil War ends is this notion of the lost cause. And I encourage you to read about it. I do believe we'll be talking about it in the next chapter. But if we don't, I encourage you to read about it, especially if you're a psych major or a sociology major. It's a very, very fascinating, complex narrative that the South uses to deal with their trauma, their collective trauma, coming out of the Civil War to rebuild. And it is amazingly complex, dark, beautiful, twisted in a lot of ways, especially when you, of course, when you think of many of the narratives that Southerners used to justify many aspects of how they lived their lives. The notion of the patriarchy, of being a patriarch to slaves. There's many facets to the lost cause mythology that also becomes very interesting in how they justified the Civil War that goes along with that. But I encourage you to read that. But prosperity was something that the Northerners felt would bring new hope to the South. They felt that it would benefit ordinary white Southerners and former slaves as well by building an industrial base and railroads. Obviously, they felt that the industrial would take Southerners away from their dependency on the agriculture base, away from the plantations, away from this need from agriculture workers, i.e. slaves, and move them towards a bright industrial future like what had fueled the Second Industrial Revolution, that really had moved the North towards its prosperity, that had really fed their revolution in technology, their revolution in moving them towards where they were and their prosperity. So they felt that would really benefit the South, and the need for developing railroads as well. So they felt that that was really what they needed to encourage in the South. Now, the only problem they faced down there was the Southern political stability was still too shaky to attract investors. Obviously, investors want stable political alliances, stable political situations going on down there, and that wasn't happening. Uh, they thought about increasing taxes to try to encourage some of the stability, which really didn't happen. And then you have the growth of this Redeemer movement that takes place. As Republicans divided with whether they should continue on this great experiment with trying to build this gospel of prosperity. And what the Redeemers were these people that had this idea that they were going to redeem the South from these evil white Northerners, and of course African Americans, because they saw African Americans as leading the South asunder. Obviously, these freed slaves were corrupting the South. Obviously, we know that's not true, but you have to realize the dynamic that was moving through the South. So now we look at a counter-revolution of terrorism and economic pressure. Now, I've alluded to the existence of the Ku Klux Klan, but what was really going on within the South that was feeding into this? Well, planners used both revolution, essentially, and terrorism to prevent black tenants from voting. And you have to realize that how they did this was they implemented things like poll taxes, literacy tests, the grandfather clause, which we'll talk about more in the next chapter as well, and flat out intimidation. We don't think about it often, but intimidation was probably the most terrifying and threatening device that they utilized clear up until the Civil Rights era to keep poor whites and African Americans away from the polls in the South. And I've actually had the privilege of talking to somebody who went with the Freedom Riders down to the South to try to register African Americans. And her accounting of going to the polls with some African Americans to help them vote was chilling. She said they were greeted at the entrance, well, not even to the entrance, at the pathway up to the polling place by a group of young white men. And she said the way that they were confronted was terrifying, to say the least. She never had experienced anything quite like that in her life, of actually being called what she was called. And she said as a Christian she wasn't even capable of repeating what they called her and what they called the young African Americans that she was with. But she said she was absolutely chilled to her bones by that interaction, and she said she honestly thought she would be murdered. We take it for granted when we go to the polling place that but there were many people that died for that privilege, for us to have that privilege, not only in fighting wars, but just for others to have that right to vote. And I think it's something that we need to appreciate a lot more when we go to vote, instead of blowing it off and going, I don't need to vote. We need to exercise our right to vote more, appreciate it more, and realize that every vote counts. Even though we may think it doesn't, it does. Our voices are heard when we step into that voting booth, um, because of those people that bravely stepped forward and made that effort, and those that didn't get a chance, those that actually, unfortunately, gave their life trying to step forward and weren't so lucky. So it's something to think about. But white radicals were ultimately shunned by society. And this is something that we don't think about with the founding of the Ku Klux Klan. Is oftentimes when we talk about the Ku Klux Klan, we automatically think that African Americans were the only ones that were targeted. The Ku Klux Klan ultimately went after anybody that would stand in the way of Southern progress, white Southern progress. So if you were a white Republican, if you were a Jew, if you were a educator, if you were a clergyman from the North, essentially if you were anyone of that ilk, including African Americans, you were their target. They were equal opportunity harassers. And what I mean by harassers is they implemented every means of torture and even went so far as murder, to make their message very clear. They didn't mess around. They burned black schools and churches. And the sad thing was that Grant was cautious in intervening. Ulysses S. Grant as president was an ineffective president. We'll talk more about Grant. He was rather, how shall I put it delicately, a man of weak character. He was the darling of the Civil War, but as a student, as a person leading into the Civil War, he really didn't stand out. He'd attended West Point. He graduated from West Point. He was the bottom 12 of his graduating class from West Point. So he wasn't a stellar student. And leading into the Civil War, even as a soldier, he really didn't stand out. If memory serves me correctly, they had stationed him out at a far outpost in the West because he really just didn't fit the bill of being a stellar soldier. When the war broke out, it wasn't until the very end that he really began to make his mark and finally become this, standout general that actually carried us to victory in the war. And then, he becomes elevated to becoming the president. But the thing that probably was to his downfall was that he was a very heavy drinker. And this was something that was very well documented about Grant, that he drank in excess very often, well too often, which is a tragedy in of itself. Also, his administration was very corrupt. And it's a wondering there if perhaps this had something to do with the fact that he would not intervene more readily in the issue with the Ku Klux Klan. That perhaps the reason he didn't intervene was that there were ties there that he knew of to people that he knew that were high in the government that also happened to be involved in the KKK, because we do know that people that were in the government were unfortunately tied to the Ku Klux Klan as well. They kept their identity. We're supposed to keep their identity secret, but we do know that it was common practice. However, a couple high-profile incidents that we will talk about later in this lecture did prompt him to eventually take action against the Ku Klux Klan and lead to several high-profile arrests. And eventually, the Ku Klux Klan was banned within the United States. But because it was banned, did not stop it from existing. It still existed. And it's documented that it did exist. It just essentially, I guess you could say, lay dormant until the 1920s. Hate never fully goes away, unfortunately. And the final section we'll talk about in this second part of the lecture will be America and the World, Reconstructing America's Foreign Policy. Now, victory in the Civil War made expansion attractive again. The United States wanted to expand its outreach into the world. And it began to make power plays all over to expand this reach. And it made several forays into the Caribbean at first. It tried to acquire the Virgin Islands from Denmark and a naval base on Santo Domingo. Obviously, these attempts were unsuccessful. Canada also became a viable prospect. Clearly, it's our northern neighbor. The Canadians showed no interest in joining the Union. Ultimately, Canada became a Commonwealth of Great Britain. The one success was the acquisition of Alaska in 1867, which was successfully purchased from Russia. So that's how we acquired Alaska. If you ever wonder that great mystery of how we acquired Alaska, that's how we acquired Alaska. So with that, we're going to end in part 2, and we will move on to part 3. So I will see you in a minute.